Nutrition Hero Podcast. Igniting both the art and the science of functional medicine. Here's your host, Dr. Brad Watts.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Nutrition Hero Podcast. Thank you for joining me. It's Dr. Brad Watts back in the podcast lab as always. I feel compelled to mention that I'm a doctor of chiropractic and an expert in functional medicine and clinical nutrition. Been getting a lot of traction lately and people asking, what kind of provider are you? Where do you find this information, doctor? And so I got to put it out there. I'm a natural health care provider. I'm a chiropractor. I focus on functional medicine and clinical nutrition and love connecting with people who do the same. So anyway, thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of what we're building, what we're doing. 2021. I think this is our second podcast of 2021. And I'm excited. It's going to be a good year. It's going to be a good year. I feel like it's going to start off a little rough, just cleaning up the bits and pieces of 2020. but I think it's going to be a good year. So mark it down. You heard it here. All right. So a little bit of predictions, as it were. Today, what I want to talk about is I want to talk about gluten-free diets and heavy metal exposure. It's kind of like the nasty side of gluten-free. And I want to talk about that because it's something that you're going to see in the medical literature coming up here. There's a group of people that are, it's more like group of corporations, but a group of people that are having a concerted effort at communicating the negatives of the gluten-free lifestyle. And I'm all right talking about that. Absolutely all right. No dogma here. And so I want to make sure that we're able to converse about that. But first, make sure that you are sharing this podcast with your friends and family. Make sure that you're subscribing. Make sure that you give us a thumbs up. Give us a like. Right, give us a ring the little bell on YouTube. Do what you got to do in order to spread Nutrition Hero far and wide. So thank you for doing that. All right. Now, if you are new to the gluten-free world, I'm going to give you my synopsis over the last 10 years of what it has looked like and why people are talking about gluten, what we're doing, etc. Gluten are a grouping of proteins. And right now in the marketplace, you can only test for, I think, like 43 or 45 different gluten proteins, but science has identified over 400 of them. So just for a little context, okay, so people are like, I got tested for gluten, doctor, and I don't have gluten sensitivity. And I go, nice. I mean, they couldn't prove that you have one. Right, as they sit there with their chronic condition and tell me that they don't have a gluten sensitivity. So remember that chronic disease is generated by DNA plus lifestyle over time gives you your chronic health outcomes. And ultimately, if you want to not have a chronic disease, that's also how you get rid of it, is by working with your DNA in a concerted effort over a longer period of time. Okay, so lifestyle and DNA over a long period of time gives you your chronic health outcomes for good and bad. And gluten happens to be one of those things that's in lifestyle. Now, it's a protein commonly found in grains, products that have grain in them. And so it's a building block. Specifically, you think of wheat. And there are specific conditions like celiac disease where a patient is not able to genetically produce the enzymes that are required in order to digest gluten, right? This is an extremely abbreviated review on gluten. Okay, if you want more info on that, there are people that have dedicated their entire lives to gluten. That's not me, and I think you'll find out here why in a minute. So when we look at this, okay, gluten, what is it? Is a protein, right? And a grouping of proteins found commonly in grains and things made with wheat flour, etc. And we have a very narrow ability to assess for gluten tolerance in the United States currently. There are over 400 variations, and we can test for 10% of them. Right, so that's an interesting scenario. Very interesting scenario. When you look at the the landscape right now in food, gluten-free diet has taken off and gluten-free products have taken off in the last 10 years. It is a multi-billion-dollar industry at this point because they're serving people that, whether they have documented evidence of it or not, feel like they do better physically, emotionally, without gluten. Okay? Documented. Or not. So some of it's subjective. A lot of it's subjective. But since when did we live in a world where the subjective didn't matter? Right? Every other place in society, our feelings and who gets offended and all this stuff matters a lot, except for health. Well, certain sections of health. One of those happens to be like, I choose to eat gluten-free. Why? Because that's what my choice is. Are you celiac? No. What is wrong with you, you crazy person? Right? That's the mentality that happens. That's the mentality. Like you live on a different planet. And I get fired up about this because people making choices, personal decisions that inconvenience others is really why gluten-free diet's annoying. Now, my family and I have been gluten-free, for a decade. Gluten-free for a decade. Okay? And right now, just thinking back as I sit here, I can count on one hand the number of times that I've had gluten in the last, it's got to be 3 or 4 years. And in general, we eat gluten-free. In general. Having said that, I'm going to read to you an article from University of Illinois in Chicago, and it's their take, right? Their commentary on a research study that happened between 2009 and 2014. I'm just going to read it to you, right? And then if you want to read it yourself, you can too. I'll leave the link in the podcast notes here, but I'm going to read it to you, and then we're going to talk about it. All right, it says gluten-free, this is in the news section. Gluten-free diet may increase the risk of arsenic, that's probably not good, and mercury exposure. Definitely not good. And it begins, people who eat a gluten-free diet may, gotta underline may, be at risk of increased exposure to arsenic and mercury, toxic metals that can lead to cardiovascular disease, cancer, neurological side effects, according to a report in the Journal of Epidemiology. First things first, I appreciate that the Journal of Epidemiology is all of a sudden concerned with mercury exposure when they've been telling you for 50 years that mercury exposure, especially in your mouth, doesn't matter. Right? I appreciate that now they're animated about it. Okay? Science only knows what it's paid to know. Don't ever forget that. Science only knows what it's paid to know. Especially epidemiologists. All right. In 2015, 25% of Americans reported eating gluten-free. That's interesting. A 67% increase from 2013. Gluten-free products often contain rice flour as a substitute for wheat. Right, interesting. So, in 2 years, you had a 67% increase in the number of people who reported eating a gluten-free diet. Rice is known to bioaccumulate, so it collects certain toxic metals, including arsenic and mercury, from fertilizers. Hey, I thought fertilizers on our food was not a problem. I thought that was not a problem. So I'm laughing here because I'm standing on a soapbox today, everybody. So I'm pretty sure I was told that fertilizers weren't a problem on my food and that I should stop talking about organic. Okay. So rice is known to bioaccumulate certain toxic metals, including arsenic and mercury, from fertilizers, soil, or water. I thought that having filtered water wasn't a problem. Okay. But little is known about the health effects of diets high in rice content. That can't be. A majority of the world has rice as a staple. Even the industrialized world. Can't be. All right, so this researcher, I'll leave their name off my podcast so that they don't feel like they're being targeted. This researcher is an assistant professor of epidemiology and biostatistics in the University of Illinois at Chicago School of Public Health. And colleagues, so this researcher and her colleagues, looked at data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. Okay, first, side note, survey, searching for a link between gluten-free diet and biomarkers of toxic metals in blood and urine. Okay, so they started out, who's paying for this is what I want to know, searching for a link between gluten-free diets and toxic metal exposure. Who would pay for that? Why are you paying for that? Unless 25% of Americans eating gluten-free is cutting into your market share. Who's paying for somebody to go look at gluten-free diets and connect them with toxic heavy metals? Okay. They found 73 participants, sample size, who reported eating a gluten-free diet among the 7,471 who completed the survey. Think about this. If 25% of Americans reported eating gluten-free, how come 73 people out of 7,471 were selected in this review? Right? Did we have information on symptoms in this survey? That would be something that would be interesting to talk about. Like in the survey of 7,471 people, who gets daily headaches? Mark an X here. Right? Who has neuropathy? Mark an X here. Who has ADD? Mark an X here. Who has headaches on a daily basis that go away in the afternoon? Mark an X here. Who's on this specific medication? Mark an X here. Right? By the way, who eats gluten-free? Mark an X here. Right? Of that 7,471, I want to see what the gluten-free diet crowd, the 73 people, okay, compares to somebody who eats the standard American diet. What does that look like? Right, once again, science only knows what is paid to know. Get this also. Participants ranged in age from 6 to 80. 6 to 80. Okay, that is a huge window of operation, a small sample, and we're not able to see the questions that were asked on this survey. We're also not able to see this gluten-free diet group compared to the other 7,000. Okay, people who reported eating a gluten-free diet had higher concentrations of arsenic in their urine and mercury in their blood than those who didn't. Okay, arsenic levels were almost twice as high for people eating a gluten-free diet, and mercury levels were 70% higher. Okay, so if we're going to bag on a gluten-free diet here, I'm all right with that. And again, you'll see why in a minute. But if we're going to bag on a gluten-free diet, then we also have to be able to talk about what signaled these 73 people out of 7,400 to get included in this sample, right? In this explanation of the sample. Was it their symptoms? Because I would have expected that we would have 25% of the 7,400 included in this survey. Okay? That's just the research they presented. So that's what I'm saying. All right. They go on to say, these results indicate that there could be unintended consequences of eating a gluten-free diet. But until we perform the studies to determine if there is corresponding health consequences that could be related to higher levels of exposure of arsenic and mercury by eating gluten-free, more research is needed before we can determine whether this diet poses significant health risk. Right? That is the mantra of every researcher on the planet. Look at all these bad things we found. Inconclusive data, but guess what? You should definitely fund more research on this before we can determine whether or not this diet poses a significant health risk. Okay, everybody freak out, and we're not going to give you any answers. In Europe, there are regulations for food-based arsenic exposure. That's correct. And perhaps that is something here in the United States that we need to consider. We regulate levels of arsenic in water, but if rice flour consumption increases and the risk of exposure to arsenic it would make sense to regulate that metal in foods as well. Okay. So I do not disagree that there is a higher level of arsenic and mercury exposure in gluten-free products. Rice is a binder. It is what it is. Okay? It is what it is. But we have to say compared to what? Compared to what? Honestly, compared to what? All right? Gluten-free and organic, gluten-free and, produced by a company that has the cash to pay for third-party testing to make sure that their rice flour isn't contaminated. These are things that I would look for when I'm purchasing gluten-free products. Is it organic? Has it been tested? I shall eat it. Simple as that. Versus somebody that says, well, it's gluten-free, so it's got to be healthy. Right? Not the case. That's like saying, regarding Diet Coke, well, there's no sugar, there's no high fructose corn syrup, it's got to be healthy. Right? Everybody fell for that hoax in the 90s. Everybody did. And then tons of people have kidney disease now. Right? Why? Well, apparently diet soda and ibuprofen and painkillers don't go hand in hand. Okay? Apparently. Now, in this instance also, I want to say this. Right? I'm not mad at these researchers at all. Okay? They're fulfilling their purpose. All right? They're fulfilling their purpose. Science only knows what science is paid to know. Gotta get that. Don't ever forget it. Science only knows what science is paid to know. And along those same lines, I do also want to lay this out. Okay? I have been putting people on gluten-free diets for a decade. For a decade. I've been doing it. Happily. Knowing that a gluten-free diet is going to have a higher level of heavy metal exposure for many people. And why have I been doing this? Because steak is also gluten-free. Because carrots are also gluten-free. Because peas are also gluten-free. Meat, vegetables, nuts and seeds, a little fruit is the gluten-free diet that I think people should be following. Bare bones. That's it. That's what it is. When we start trying to replace food types with a different food chemistry, okay, that's when we get into trouble. That's when we get into trouble. So beer and pizza. Gluten-free beer and gluten-free pizza may not activate your immune system the same way that Miller and Pizza Hut do. Okay? But they're still going to destroy your health. They will, especially if they are your habit, your go-to. But if you're somebody that's willing to eat meat and vegetables, nuts and seeds, and a little fruit, if you're willing to do that, you can go have the gluten-free pizza and the gluten-free beer. But when it becomes a habit instead of an event, it's when you start to get the side effects. So what I want to know in these studies is this. What kind of gluten-free diet were they following? Were they following a gluten-free standard American diet? Beer, well, not the 6-year-olds, but beer, pizza, gluten-free bread, gluten-free buns, gluten-free cereal, gluten-free donuts, gluten-free Pop-Tarts. You get the idea. Gluten-free cake, gluten-free brownies, all the stuff. All right? Eat gluten-free and eat those, and I guarantee you're going to feel like trash in a week. Guarantee it. A gluten-free diet that is still heavy in carbohydrates, you will feel like garbage. You will. I promise. I've seen it every day for 10 years. You're going to feel like garbage. So when you're walking through the gluten-free aisle at the grocery store, keep going. Go to the butcher counter. Go to the vegetables. Right? Don't substitute the chemistry of the food you love, okay, and say, oh, I'm gluten-free now, I'm making a better health decision, because you don't actually know if you are. We're going to trade like gluten enteropathy for heavy metal mercury poisoning? Are you going to do that? You might be. Meat, vegetables, nuts and seeds, and a little fruit. That's what I'm saying. All right, this is a really short podcast today because what I wanted to let you know is if you are a provider, I'm going to be doing a longer expose on this, right, at a Biogenetics Casual Friday event coming up very soon. And we're going to lay all of this stuff out. We're going to lay it out. Different research articles. We're going to talk about enteropathy. We're going to talk about the mechanics of this. And we're going to talk about why, if you're going to be gluten-free, if you're going to be sharing gluten-free values, if that's a thing we can say, if you're going to share gluten-free information with your patients, don't do them a disservice, okay? Even though the researchers, in my opinion, are like jaded here, even though that's the case, even though science only knows what it's paid to know, you still have to understand that rice is a binder. Rice is going to carry a whole host of things you don't want to digest in your body, right? If you're going to be gluten-free, do it the right way. Meat, vegetables, nuts and seeds, a little fruit. All right. Thank you for tuning in to the Nutrition Hero podcast today. On a brief hit, we'll see you next time.